Hello class, we are doing week 5. This is human development and we're talking about ethnocentrism and racism. So remember, there's always a difference between race and ethnicity. The race is the color of my skin that is determined by my genotype, which are my genetic makeup, my DNA, and then my phenotype, which is what you see of me. So in true fashion, there are only 3 races: Black, white, or Asian. So everybody else fits somewhere on that scale. So now ethnicity is different. So you may be a Hispanic and maybe a Black Hispanic, you may be a white Hispanic, or if we look down in like Central America, we see a lot of our Hispanics, like Peru, that they're of an Asian descent. So those are the only 3 races. So if you watch like CSI and it talks about he dug up a dead body and there was no skin remaining and there was skeletal remains, and they say it's a young Chinese Asian female. They know that by the genetic makeup, okay? So while you may be the same as we're teaching in Georgia, so while you may look the same as some people that live upstate New York, you're the same race, you're definitely not the same ethnicity. Okay, so we're going to talk about some things today. Okay, so like I said, ethnicity an ethnic group has a sense of togetherness. The members form a special group. An ethnic group is a distinct group of people who share the same culture, religion, language, dietary practice, national origin, or other common history. Okay, so we can usually use ethnicity and your culture in the same vein. So my culture is, so I live in the South. I wouldn't consider myself Southern, but so my ethnicity is a Southern woman of color. I am of the Christian belief. I live in a subdivision that we're friends with each other. So if you ask me my ethnicity, that's what I would tell you, okay? My ethnicity includes what we eat. So as an African American, growing up, I ate lots and lots of pork, right? And that can be traced back to slavery, because African Americans, when they were slaves, were only allowed to eat the parts that the massa didn't want to eat. So a lot of the things that carry on from my ethnicity, not necessarily my race, my ethnicity, come from slavery, okay? The term ethnocentrism tells me that I am the best. The world centers around my ethnicity. America is great for thinking that we are the best. We like to go to other countries and help them be more American. We will help them become more democratic. We often go into countries and change their religious beliefs. So a country that is poor as Haiti, that definitely always needs assistance. Many times that assistance comes with good white people coming from the US who are going to share their beliefs about God's love. And again, so that is not a bad thing, but we somehow believe our ethnicity, our belief system is better than everybody else's. So like I said, racism is often taken as an ethnic group, but they're not the same, right? So in comparison to ethnocentrism, racism is more likely to be on a physical difference, what you can see. So racism is somehow that other races are better than others. So in most countries, it's the majority. So the majority has the power. So in America, the power is by white America, 60% white Americans compared to 13.9% of African Americans. So then what we see on the news oftentimes is racism by the people that are in power against the minority, which is our brown and black people. Okay. Some terms again. Prejudice is just how I feel. We can't legalize feelings. So prejudice, that preconceived notion in regard to race and ethnicity, both, right? People apply racist stereotypes to all members of the group. So prejudice is against my belief system. So those of you that don't live or haven't always lived in the South, you know, there is a kind of a stereotype of Southern people. Right, so we think sometimes that the mimic of like not being as intelligent, living on the farm, maybe missing some teeth. Things are that's the stereotype that we have of people in the South, and that is just not always true. So stereotypes that's my prejudice, because if I believe that, that's what I'm thinking. Discrimination, on the other hand, is illegal. So I don't know if we can keep our thoughts separate from our actions, but discrimination is if I won't hire you because of your skin color, your race, your sexual orientation, and that is illegal. Okay, minority group relations is in the unfair treatment of persons. It's based on prejudice. So discrimination is based on prejudice, but discrimination is against the law. That's the main difference. Okay, can we talk about stereotypes? So stereotypes are kind of what we believe, the things that we used to say about each other, or things that we have heard or passed down. And certainly as we talk about culture, it's important to understand there are some typical things that come with the client's culture, but not everybody, and we definitely cannot assume that that's going to be true with every person of that culture. Okay, so some stereotypes, when we think about things like what mothers or fathers or teenagers or communists, Republicans, Democrats, we all have this thought in our mind when I say the word Democrats, or I say the Republican Party. That brings about a stereotype of what we believe all all of those Democrats look like, or all the Republicans will look like. Okay, and that's not true, of course. So, for example, historically, there's been an erroneous stereotype that Native Americans become easily intoxicated and irrational when using alcohol. The belief was translated into laws prohibiting Native Americans from buying and selling alcohol. Okay, in truth, on the reservation, you cannot buy alcohol. So there are people who set up liquor stores going in out the reservation, and people are going out the reservation, but you can't have any on the reservation. Okay, so we do know that with some genetic testing that many times our First People do have a different tolerance level, and that's a genetic piece. Okay, but not all Native Americans are alcoholics. A more recent stereotype is that African Americans have the ability to play basketball and certain other sports, right? Well, at first glance, it seems like a stereotype, but it has broader negative indications. So if people believe that all Black people can dance or play basketball, then that's a stereotype. So if I can't play basketball, then you're looking at me like, what's wrong with you? So I definitely remember in high school, I'm tall, I'm 5'9", and everyone's like, go out for the basketball team, go play volleyball. I am the least coordinated person ever, really. So I did not. So definitely, my kid's dad was much more athletic. So thank goodness my kids have some athletic abilities, but they didn't get it from mom. Okay. So at race and ethnic discrimination, the problem of whites. So I try to think about not necessarily white people, but think of the majority. So when I travel and I go to the islands and to the cultures where people look more like me, the power are the black people, right? So the minority when I go to the islands are the white people. So when I go to the Caribbean, I see all of the beautiful signs for makeup are beautiful black people. The signs outside of Macy's and the high-end stores are beautiful black people. The mannequins are all black and brown. So America stores things are really based on the majority, which in this country is white people. The white majority determines the place of non-whites and other ethnic groups in our society. The status of different minority groups in other societies, because whites apply different stereotypes. For example, African Americans are viewed and treated different than Japanese Americans, right? Majority relationships becomes recognized by the minority relationships become recognized by the majority as a social problem. Okay, so blacks can't do this. Blacks are always poor. Japanese kids are the smartest in class. Chinese kids are the smartest in class, right? Those are still stereotypes that are getting based from the majority of the population in the United States, and that would be our white Americans. Okay, so talking about follow, and this is kind of timely, I guess. Today is September 16th. So this talks about what happened on September 11th. So of course we had the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and there were tons of hate crimes against our Arabian and our American Muslims, right? Because they looked like the terrorist. So in Texas, a Pakistani Muslim student was murdered. In California, an Egyptian Christian was killed. In Chicago suburbs, hundreds of men and women shouted USA around a local mosque, and they were stopped by police. The mosque, of course, is a Muslim place of worship. And I think we can even move to more recently. We saw, and they're still seeing, lots of hate and hate crimes toward our Chinese people. Of course, we are still uncertain of the start of COVID, but we do know that it did start in Wuhan, China. So we have seen really some hate crimes regarding that population. And very recently, so in Atlanta, we had, there was a man, and again, I'm in Georgia, so not far from here. There was a man who shot and killed several massage parlor owners. And the ones he shot were all Asian. Okay, so yeah, all Asian. So, but again, we're seeing a high increase of discrimination, of discriminatory acts against people that are Asian. Asian American who many times have lived here their whole life, but because of their phenotype, how they look like the other people, so somehow we group them all together. Okay, mosques, Arabian community centers, and Arab-owned businesses were vandalized. Women and girls wearing the traditional head covering, hijab, have been harassed and assaulted. And again, so imagine you're walking down the street and you've done nothing and you're minding your own business, and someone comes up and harasses you because of the way that you look. And especially then, because we knew that the terrorists were of that many of them were, yes, of Muslim belief, but the same way that many radical Christians take the Bible and do harm based on their belief or their interpretation of the Bible. Many the people from 9/11 then also use their Quran and interpret it in a way that would hurt people. So not all Muslims are bad people, not all Christians are bad people. So that's what we do, though. We stereotype many times. Okay. This is white privilege, and oftentimes I explain this. So it is not It is nothing that you've done. Many of my white students and even my white friends are like, wait, I don't have any privilege, I don't have any privilege. But being the majority, you do have privilege. There are things that are for you, made for you. For example, when I go into the grocery store and I look for nude pantyhose, or I look for nude makeup, it doesn't match my skin. When I'm traveling inside the US, I always wonder if I need hair care products, where will I go? And if you've never ever looked, please look the next time you go to your Walgreens, Walmart, CVS, and you'll see that the ethnic hair and ethnic hair and makeup is like this big, right? And this whole part, then is made for people who are the majority. Okay, so white privilege. Here are some of the things. White people can go shopping alone and pretty much be assured they will not be followed or harassed. And I do know there's going to be somebody who says, well, I've been followed too. And I would agree with that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the majority of white people don't do that. When you see, when you come into the store, you often see, and I've experienced the security guard following me or watching me. Because somehow the stereotype that black people are poor or that we will steal permeates throughout the South especially, okay? White people have no problem finding housing to rent or purchase in an area they can afford and want to live in. So I clearly remember when we moved here, there were places that we were told we shouldn't live. When I moved in my neighborhood, which was it's a very old, established, majority white neighborhood, my neighbor said to me, older white gentleman, he said, no, we don't want no problems in here. It's been a quiet neighborhood. We don't want no problems. Like, okay, what do you think we'll do? You know, if I can afford to live in the same house that you live in, what do you think we're going to do? I had 3 children at the time, living at home, and you know, we didn't cause any harm. It's funny because my neighborhood, the guy beside me, the police are at his house every other day. He's a former, well, occasional meth user. So yeah, police are there all the time. Never been to my house. So it's a lot different. And the stereotype, again, moving in is, oh my goodness, the black people are going to move in. And I guess they thought we would play maybe rap music and thump it through the neighborhoods. I don't know. Okay, but again, that's a stereotype. White people can feel assured that their children were given curriculum, materials in testifying of the existence of their race. Okay, so what that means is the majority of social studies and history classes are based on Christopher Columbus and how he sailed the ocean blue, and how, you know, all of the majority, the George Washington, the Abraham Lincoln, and all of those things are based on the majority of white people. So in order for my children to know about their African American history and the great things that African Americans have done, I've had to teach them that because school doesn't teach that. So the African American heritage really talks about coming from kings and queens, and Africa was one of our first societies where there was money and communication, and people learned a written language. So when slavery started, a lot of people didn't realize that these people came from different tribes. This wasn't just one big group. This is like, you know, Michigan and Tennessee and Ohio, like all these different areas, and suddenly they were taken from that tribe and put together as somehow all black people or all Africans were alike. So slavery still has its roots. It still intertwines with who we are in the country. Okay, so again, the majority and the views still are seen as somehow black people and brown people are less than. White people can go to any supermarket and find staples that fit their cultural conditions, right? So if I am Asian and I'm looking for some Asian products or the sauce or what I use, I have to go to a special store, right? I got to go to the Asian market. I'm not going to go to Walmart and find what I'm looking for. So again, when you're the majority, you don't have to worry about that. Now, of course, if you were in China and you were the minority, you were a white person in China, when you went to the grocery store, you would find all Chinese food. And you'd have to go to a different store to find your food. But again, this is privilege that white people have in this area. And all throughout the United States. When people use checks, credit cards, or cash, they can be sure their skin color is not taken into account regarding their financial reliability. Okay, so I remember being in stores and just showing the guy in front of me had used his credit card and gone through, and I go and I've got my Gold American Express, and she asked me for ID. Like, you didn't ask him for ID, why would you ask me? That somehow that it must be stolen. And again, this stereotype continues to pass on because whites are the majority, and this is privilege that you have. As social workers, we need to always remember that we are fighting for the underdogs, the Black, the brown, the minority, the marginalized people, our LGBTQ community. So we're always fighting for the people that don't have the privilege or the power. White people are never asked to speak for all white people. And what that means is many times, if I'm at well, before COVID, I'd be at a party or some kind of event, and somebody would ask me, so, you know, how do Black people feel about Trump? I don't know. I know how I feel about Trump, but I can't tell you how all Black people feel about Trump. So when I speak, I'm representing my whole country, my whole race. That doesn't happen if you're white. You can go to the hairdresser and find someone who cuts your hair easily. So my daughter is away at school, so I'm calling saying, do you have a Black stylist? And what they'll tell me is, no, we have white people who can do Black people hair. Like, you know, I'm looking for a Black stylist. And I'm wondering how many of you, as you're listening to this, that are of the majority, how many of you have gone to a Black stylist? Right? Have you called and said, oh, I need to find a Black stylist? So when you walk in, there's someone who has your type of hair that looks like you, that easily can do your hair. There's a super cuts on every corner, right? But if I'm the majority, the minority, that doesn't work for me. So my daughter's at college now, and I'm calling around trying to find a Black stylist. And yes, I do realize that there are white people that can do her hair. But again, just as you prefer a white stylist, I prefer a Black stylist. White people in affluent neighborhoods are generally confident that their neighbors will be neutral and pleasant to them. Like I said, white people, when they move in, when the Black family moves in, there's no guarantee that they're going to be neutral, right? I promise you, I'm from South Florida, where it's very much, white people are not the majority. It's very diverse. If you speak English, you're in the majority. So there are tons of people that look like me. Maybe they're not the same ethnicity, lots of Jamaicans, lots of Haitians, lots of dark Cubans, lots of Brazilians that were dark, so lots of people that looked like me. So when I moved to Tennessee, there were really some thoughts that came to my mind. You know, I really thought maybe I'd wake up one morning with, you know, big old burning cross in my yard, the sign of the Klan, okay? So, yeah, and this was about, you know, 10, 11 years ago. And I don't think things are that much different now. White people can assume the police officer will protect them and assist them. Okay, so Black children many times have grown up to be afraid of the popo because they've seen the popo pull over their mom and dad for no reason. And if you can remember the George Floyd incident. So what I think many of our majority population doesn't understand is that's always gone on in the African American community. And until we had cameras, you didn't know. One of the things I tell my white friends is you don't have to have that conversation with your kids. So I have 3 children, and as a Black mother, there's a different conversation you have to have when your kids start driving. So my kids know, you know, when the police pull them over, to call me, put the phone down, right? Because you don't be reaching for anything, but put the phone down so I can hear. So I can hear. Don't argue with the policeman. Keep your hands, you know, where he can see them. Don't make any sudden moves. all of those things because I need my children to come home alive. And I don't think that's a conversation the majority of my friends have ever had with their kids. But as a Black mom, the rules are different. The rules are different. So my daughter, who was always stubborn, a lot like me, we live on the northern side of town, and she worked on the other side of town. So I would say, get off work, and mind you, all of my children had their own cars, they had money, they had cash in their pocket from working. So I would say, get off from work, get directly on the interstate and come back to our side of town. Just be safe, come home. My daughter, of course, who has her own mind and still does, mommy's my child, definitely, she would get off work and drive through town. And she would drive through town with her windows down, thumping her music. And while, yes, every American should have that right, that she should, but for her, that was dangerous. So she got pulled over several times, and I explained to her it was called driving while Black. So she didn't do anything, she was just driving while Black. So one time there was a police car in downtown, and she didn't go over to the other lane. So he called back up and had people pull her over. Didn't give her a ticket, shining the light in her window, right? See if they can find drugs or something. Another time she got pulled over for having a small crack in her window. And yes, I do know that that's illegal. We all know. But how many times have you been pulled over for cracking your window, right? So just things that are different when you're the minority, and especially the fear of police is very real for African-American community. Okay, I've always said to my children, I can sue the police officer later, I can sue the court later. I just need you to come home alive. And that's not a fear that white Americans have. White people can assure their race will not account against them if they need legal or medical help. Okay, so again, some simple signs of white privilege. Hate crimes. Hate crimes are crimes that are specifically against a minority because of their belief, the way they look, or their sexual orientation. I think remember the story in, I think it was Texas, and they grabbed the gay male out of the bar, and they drug him and tortured him all because he was gay. So awful, awful story. I just can't imagine someone hurting someone just based on, you don't like me because how I look or who I sleep with. Okay. Examples of hate crime include African-American churches on fire. The history of the church, let me tell you how painful that is for the African-American community. The church has always been this safe place. So even back in slavery times, when things were coming, when you were trying to avoid being beat, the church was a sacred and holy place. So to burn African-American churches is a fear like no other, because that's the one place people were safe. And one of the things in churches is that is where African-Americans could speak freely, could talk about things that you couldn't discuss among others. Okay? So my African Americans, hey, I'm teaching, what's up?
Oh, so next to you. Bye.
Sorry guys, that was my daughter. Okay, so in December 31st is of course it's New Year's Eve, but for the African American community, it's been known for a long time as Watch Night. And Watch Night is based coming from slavery, where the families would get together and pray, and they were praying that the massa would not come and split the families up. So that was Watch Night. So on the 1st of January, that's when taxes were due. And you had to pay for the amount of tax, you pay taxes on your property, right? And your slaves were your property. So when the black families are praying together that God allows them to be safe and doesn't separate families. And many times what was happening is the male was sold off. So even going forward, that's why you see many times in the African American community, it is a female, sometimes led community based on feelings, just based on history. Okay. Race is a social concept. So this means that it really is something that we have kind of come up with. Despite definitional problems, it is necessary to use racial categories, right? Institutionalized racism is something that's different than individualized racism. Institutionalized racism is that it's built in our system, that I'm treated differently because of the majority in our system. There have been studies of African Americans and brown and black people in waiting rooms that many times they're seen differently. They're not their aid or their illness, what they came for, is not somehow seen as necessary as a white American. So the waiting times for brown and black Americans are longer in waiting rooms, many times based on research. And I know you're going to say, I was in a waiting room and the black guy got first. Again, I'm not saying that's all the time, but based on research, okay? So when we're looking at those systems, that's the goals that we're trying to change the laws. So much in America has been ran by by black, older white men, right? So to see Kamala Harris as our first female black VP, right? Or Barack Obama to be our black president is really kind of new. It's like exciting for the people, the brown and black people. So maybe that laws will change. Maybe it'll be based more on the minority, as opposed on the majority. Individualized racism, of course. When white terrorists bomb a black church and kill 5 black children, that's an act of individual racism. Okay, and that's based on a true story. The black girls that were killed in the bombing, and bombing churches just because you didn't like black people. Okay. So in the same city, 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities. Thousands more destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, and intellectually. That's a form of institutionalized racism built in the system. So as we watched Hurricane Ida is the one we're seeing now, but even before that, when we saw Katrina hit, one of the things that we saw, the people standing on the roof, people that couldn't get out, those were our black and brown people, and black and brown and poor people. So the majority of white Americans, just packed up and left, right? You get in your car and you pack your belongings and you go stay in a hotel. So many times black people don't have those resources. So that's an example of institutionalized racism, right? If a hurricane is coming, our goals should be to get everybody out, not just the ones that have a place to go or not just the ones that can afford it. And yes, I hear the story. Many people chose to stay behind. But if we look at the history, many people chose to stay behind because they had no way to get out. Okay, so institutionalized, to end that, we would maybe run buses through those hurricane zones to get people out, to help them get their stuff out, right? So that way that the brown, the black, the poor aren't always treated differently. Okay, so in social work, of course, discrimination and oppression in our macro systems, that's that institutionalized racism, that's our macro system. Family counseling agency will assign the less skilled counselors and thereby provide lower quality services in offices located in minority neighborhoods. Same way here. So the school system that where I live, the school system there, so new teachers have to take the first opening. Okay, you can't pick and choose your school. New teachers take the first opening. And so when you're a new teacher, you have to stay in your first space for 3 years. So the new teachers most often are placed in our inner city, Black, brown, poor schools. The students know that this, a young white teacher is riding her time, right? Because in 3 years, she can go and find another school. So as opposed to putting the best teachers and all of the best resources where our poor communities are to make it even, we end up putting then our less skilled, right, people where the need is most. Human Services Agencies encourages white applicants to apply for refunds for special needs or certain needs, whereas non-white clients are often not informed of such services. A Human Service Agency takes the process of non-white funds, takes longer to process non-white funds. Police departments discriminate against non-white staff in terms of working assignments. A real estate agency has shown a pattern of showing white home buyers housed in white neighborhoods, and of course African Americans in predominantly mixed or African American. A bank and insurance company engage in redlining. So redlining is a history that is gone around for since, probably since the 40s. Just kind of talk about redlining. So redlining, and when blacks were, and we talk about the 12 years after slavery, all the laws that were put in place that African Americans, for them to stay oppressed, one of those things was redlining. Show you what it looks like. So at the time, what would happen is we would draw districts. Let me see if I can find this area. Let me use Dalton, it's a little bigger. Show me this stuff. Okay, but so redlining is places where people could not get loans. Okay, so banks would not lend to people that lived in certain areas. Okay, so looking at this, so this is April 24th, but this is the 1930s. An appraiser went to Brooklyn to assess Bed-Stuy, that's one of our oldest neighborhoods, for government-subsidized neighborhood prospect on a single page. So many brownstones were obsolete, and poorly kept, right? The clerks, the laborers, the foreign-born, the Jews, the Irish mostly lived, right? So what they did is they would say where the worst people live, where not so that crime was the highest, but where the poorest people would live. And lines were drawn in the cities across the country to celebrate the hazardous and declining from the desirable and the best. Okay, and it was coded so you couldn't get a bank loan. So when we say that so in the areas in the red, right, those were places that you wouldn't get a loan. And again, not this time in Brooklyn, it's based on Brooklyn, New York, it was based on immigrants and poor people. That's where you couldn't get a loan. And what happened is it later, it happened with African Americans as well. So what happens if you live in these areas and you can't get a loan? You have to rent, right? And we know that home ownership is one of the things that really increases income. So home ownership is a huge thing. So it still has happened, it still happens. I think there's one in Chattanooga. Let me show you what that one looks like. So if you know Chattanooga, it kind of looks at what it looks like. Okay. It's not showing me redlining though. Oh wait. This historical map originates from Tennessee Supreme case and the details of 9th Street neighborhood in 1911. The map legend explains the brown indicates business housing, green is salons, and black-owned property accompanied by Negroes. So the term at the time. Okay, so we see. There we go, if you can see the map. So this is Chattanooga, and this is from, I think it's actually 2011 is when it first started, the redlining. I'm sorry, 1911, wow, or early 1900s. So you can see, if you know Chattanooga at all, you can see that the places that were redlined were people that, again, the minority parts of the city. Map there, see what the legend says. Okay, so if you can see the legend there, it talks about where you should live. So the green is the best place to live. Definitely get a bank loan. The blue is the second one. The fourth is the red. And the reds were places where you couldn't get a bank loan. Okay, so if you see, even now, those are still some of our poor areas, because what we know is ownership builds money. Ownership takes pride in the neighborhood. And we say now, oh my goodness, how come Black people don't own houses? There's a history of not being able to buy a house. So it's just different in the African American community than it is in other places. Okay, so redlining, again, that's something that still happens, or the history of it still affects people. There are lower property values in the redlining district. So that is institutionalized racism. The law has changed, but yet it still continues. Go back to my page. Okay. So, again, some histories of white privilege, how it's helped, how it's hurt many brown or blacks. Okay, and again, so we're going to take into consideration when working with poor families that many times the opportunities that were awarded to white families were not awarded to black families. Okay. So again, in all parts of our life, many examples are, we did this already, the neighborhood, the taxes, things like that. Okay, let's go back. So this says, no single theory has provided a complete picture of why racial and ethnicity discrimination occurs. Being exposed to a lot of theories, social workers and counselors should be sensitized to the nature of and source of discrimination. Okay, so in the helping professions, we're going to be aware of the history. So projection is one of my defense mechanisms. Projection is when I project what I see about me onto you. I always think it's kind of like the projection in the back of the movie theater, and it's projecting my stuff out on everybody. So this defense mechanism attributes others' characteristics that one is unwilling to recognize in myself. Many people have personality traits that they dislike in themselves. They want to get rid of those traits, but they can't. It's not always possible, right? Okay. For example, minority groups may serve as a projection of prejudiced persons' fears and lust. People who view African Americans as lazy or preoccupied with sex may be rejecting their own stuff onto them. African Americans, yes. While some white people view African Americans as promiscuous, historically it's generally has been white men who forced African American women, particularly slaves, into sex encounters. It appears that white men felt guilty about their sexual desires and adventures and dealt with the guilt by protecting their own lust, by projecting their own lust, their own stuff onto African Americans. Also remember that, you were the property. So he could come in and he could take you whenever he so chose. Okay. Another reason is kind of a frustration and a way to put my anger, right? So with COVID, especially with COVID, we're all still suffering from the pandemic, and we are looking for someone to blame. We're looking for, oh my gosh, I lost my job, my kids are stuck at school or stuck at home all day, I'm angry. So I'm looking at some blame. And it's easy to find a minority group, the Chinese, right, to blame them. So it's much easier for me to use them as a scapegoat, where I'm putting all of my stuff. I wouldn't have lost my job if it weren't for the Asians. I wouldn't have lost my kids would be home all day if it weren't for the Asians. So it's easy to find a way to put that anger when you're all totally frustrated yourself. The term scapegoat derives from a Hebrew ritual in which the goat was symbolically laden with the sins of the entire community, then chased into the wilderness. So in the earlier Hebrew times, right, you would put all your sins on the goat, and then he was chased away. So that's where that term comes from, scapegoat. Insecurity, inferiority. So some insecure people seek to make them feel themselves better by putting other people down. Okay, so somehow I'm a better person if I put other people down. Authoritarianism, of course, that's the way in our country that the people with power rule. Right? It's not a say so. It's in the community. We have the most money. We hire the politicians. All those things, and I'm able to stay in power with that. Okay. Talks about religion. So the belief in one true religion. Okay. So we have to remember when it comes to religious differences, we also have to be aware that there's no one true religion. And I know, I'm going to hear it, oh my goodness, my religion is the only one, or this is the only one. As social workers, we don't get to make that decision. My values are different in the code of ethics, right? And my values can't get in the way of working with my client. So feeling superior to others often leads to people to evaluate them heathens over there and treat them in an inferior way. Okay, so them Jewish people over there, right? The Muslims over there, there's something wrong with them because they don't believe in the God that I believe in. So that is many times, especially in the South. The South is known for the Bible Belt. So we're really careful of working with our clients. Again, white supremacy. Okay, that's the power. So that comes, the belief in white supremacy has frequently been a factor that led whites to discrimination against people of color. So white discrimination was a dominant belief in the United States before the American Civil War, during Reconstruction. In many states, until recently, it was interracial marriages were illegal. I'm from South Florida, and if you drive by the mansions on the beach, you'll see there's still a house in the back because it was illegal for your servants, your maid, to sleep under the same roof if they're a different color. And this was up to like the 1960s. Okay, it wasn't enforced as it was earlier, but the houses are still there. So your African American maid or babysitter or all the things that people of service did could work in your house all day, but couldn't sleep in your house. Okay. White supremacy was a dominant belief before the American Civil War. Many states, I said that, banned abortion. Abraham Lincoln. So one of the presidents was Abraham Lincoln. He believed that blacks and whites could not coexist in the same nation. He promoted the idea of colonization, resettling blacks in foreign countries. He earned blacks to be resettled in Central America because of the similarity of client conditions to Africans. Okay, so again, Abraham Lincoln, right? He's kind of known as the one who freed the slaves. So he said that whites and blacks could not live together. A lot of African Americans, when they had the chance, returned back to Africa. There is, I'm trying to think one of the countries in Africa. Here we go, Liberia. Okay, so Liberia was actually, it's the West Coast, and that's when African Americans left the United States. That's where they went. So Liberia on the continent of Africa was a colonized American place. Okay. So that is Liberia. So African Americans, shortly as soon as many became free or had the opportunity, left and went back to Africa. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, talking about white supremacy, where that's coming from. So the impact on social and economic forces, the cost of discrimination and oppression. Oppression means I have the power and I'm pressing you down by not letting you have any of the power. So then racial discrimination is a barrier in our competitive society today. So a discrimination also fits heavily into the psychological complex. All of us have it as self-identity. Okay, and it's important to see people that look like me, looking into the mirror, looking into society, to look like people like me. When members of minority groups are treated by the majority group as if they're inferior, second-class citizens, it's substantially more difficult for members to develop a positive identity. Okay, so young children of groups who are the victims of discrimination are likely to develop low self-esteem at an early age. African American children who have been subjected to discrimination even have a preference for white dolls and white playmates over blacks. So we have sometimes our own children have seen, again, you walk into the store and it's better now, but all the beautiful dolls are lily white, right? That white is right and white is better because of the oppression that is often seen in throughout the media, throughout in school. You know, most children, most of their teachers are going to be white females. So that's the role model that they see as good. Stereotyping and multiculturalism. The model minority, that's our Asian population. They're the model minority. because we believe that Asian children are so much smarter and work so much harder than African American children or American children. And the truth is, they do, because in China and Japan, China especially, going to college isn't a guarantee. It's not based on how much money you have. There are very few slots in, and if you don't make it, there's no other choice. So that's why our Asian children many times are so competitive and study so hard, because there's been a long history of, if you wanted to get in college in China, you had to be the best and the brightest. It's interesting though, so I think August 1st, China did ban all of the extracurricular activities. They banned all the tutoring that children were getting after school. So what they did is they are trying to even the playing field, right? So there's no tutoring, there's no after school, there's no homework, okay? And the goal is, according to the Chinese government, is to equalize, make it more fair for people, that it wasn't fair for people who had money that could pay tutors to study more, and that kids in China weren't able to get, didn't have a normal life. Okay, so kind of looks like the overhaul of giant tutoring industries creates millions of personal dramas across the country. Instructors are being thrown out in droves, and Chinese parents now face new worries about securing their children's future. The upheaval grew out of a government clampdown unveiled in July that bans all tutoring related to the core school syllabus during vacations and weekends for students. Okay, so that happened in July, and then while barring private tutoring companies from going or racing to get paid to tutor. Okay, so then what it looks like now, there's more than $100 million was wiped out of the value market. There are lots and lots of countries that American VIP Kids, italki, a lot of those companies that were paying people to teach English to Chinese people are out of business. So there's initial shock, shutting down classes, laying off employees, closing office, educational companies. So what do they do next to survive? The answer varies, of course, from company to company, but they'll pick up the pieces. So then, this is kind of what our looked like in China. So what you see, the rural areas, that's my green, and that's most often my poor areas. The urban areas are going to be like the inner city, like Beijing, or any of the major cities in China where people who have money live, and many times lots and lots of money. So you see that all the time, the whole time, that my urban city kids, the kids who had more money, were getting much more opportunities than the other children, right? So if I take out those paid tutoring services, take out the fact that mom and dad now can't pay for private tutors, it's going to even the playing field, okay? So a lot of families worry, what capabilities will our next generation need to compete with the global stage? They're wondering about the education there. So the Beijing authorities suggested a change to focus on sectors that are not affected by new regulation, including high schools, vocational education, all-around education. Okay. So then, knowing that things have changed, it will be interesting in a couple of years to see what it looked like. This one. We see that the number of where the revenue came from. Okay, so participation after school run by firms, companies, or individuals. So again, if we're comparing, look, our urban had many individual tutors, right? Individual tutors. Our poor people many times could pay for-profit companies And these are, again, for-profit tutors. So what they did is they've said there's no more at all. And again, after school hiring expenses, you see again, my rural areas always get less than my majority areas. Okay, so that's just something interesting to know when we talk about the model majority. Okay, that's a term that somehow puts Chinese and Japanese kids on a pedestal, and really, not necessarily that they're smarter, they've really just had to, they know growing up that I may not get into college if I don't do what I'm supposed to do. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this chapter, guys, just so you know. Be sure that you go and finish reading the chapter. It's important to make sure that you understand ethnicity, the history of African American culture, right? The slaves of the life of a slave, how hard it was, and again, how so many of those things are passed down. Okay. I'm going to wrap you up, guys. Be sure that you read this chapter. It's very, very interesting when it talks about history and African American history, especially, okay, because we're the largest majority right now. Okay. It's been a pleasure, guys. I will see you next week.